come up virtually and speak with you all in Washington. It's very exciting to me to be able to share what's going on here in California in terms of how we are approaching groundwater management now within the state. And I'll just say it's a great opportunity to share ideas and thinking. I've done a little bit of work in the Washington state area supporting projects and consulting. And there's a lot to learn about how things are done differently and similarly. And I think sharing of these ideas really advance the ball, if you will, in honing in on our technical expertise to manage our water resources more effectively. So without further ado, I will dive into an update or a briefing, give you an idea of what the sustainable groundwater management is. So if I can get this thing right. Okay, there we go. So California is interesting in the way that we have administered our water resources in the state. In particular, back in 1914, we established our water rights structure within the state and began managing surface waters from that point forward. In 1914, it was considered to include groundwater as a managed water right within the state. But at the time, it was determined that there just simply wasn't enough data and information or need to manage our groundwater resources in a similar fashion. So fast forward 100 years later, here we are in 2014, and we're seeing significant impacts to our groundwater systems in the way of depletions of our interconnected surface water bodies, impacts through subsidence to our conveyance structures, which you can see pictured there, and really limiting our ability to manage our surface water the way we had once envisioned. So SGMA came about out of necessity. We saw a lot of dry wells and a lot of impacts. So the legislature took action in 2014 and enacted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, also known as SGMA. So, for Californians, many people don't have a grasp of what California or what groundwater is. And these are largely, we're focused on our alluvial groundwater basins in the state, which we have 515. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But in general, our groundwater supports our drinking water systems, our environment, our industrial and business practices, including agriculture, one of the largest in the world. And so it's very imperative that we start to manage these resources so we don't continue to see the impacts that we have been observing for the last several decades. So a quick run through in the timeline of SGMA, but this is an important slide I want to spend a little bit of time on, just to describe what the major building blocks are of SGMA. So again, I mentioned in 2014, the law was signed, the bill was signed into law, and we began implementing SGMA at that point. So who does it affect? One of the primary functions here is that SGMA relies upon local agencies to define sustainability locally based upon consideration of the beneficial uses and users in the basin and how groundwater is utilized and what those impacts could be. So there are four main groups of people here that are represented. The stakeholders. These are our beneficial uses and users. These are the people in the basins. These are the people utilizing groundwater. And it's imperative that the local agencies engage with them to define what sustainable conditions are in the basin. And so then we have the local agencies. The local agencies under SGMA were required to develop groundwater sustainability agencies. So a brand new government entity to manage groundwater moving forward. These were typically based upon existing water districts, reclamation districts, water managers to begin with. But these water managers were largely providing water supply. Now they're being tasked with managing the groundwater system. So there's a big learning curve, and they've been working diligently to get over that curve and get SGMA implemented. And then there's the Department of Water Resources. That's DWR. That's the agency that I work for. Our responsibility is twofold. It's a regulatory responsibility as well as an assistance function. So the regulatory responsibilities include the review of the groundwater sustainability plans and making sure that folks are moving in an adequate fashion towards their sustainability goals. And then we also have the State Water Resource Control Board. State Water Resource Control Board in California is responsible for administering our surface water rights system. So they are integral to, really allocating the surface waters and making sure that they are being put to a beneficial use across the state. They serve as a backstop. Should the department determine that local agencies aren't making adequate progress or failed to develop a plan, they can step in and help manage the basin while the local agencies correct their deficiencies or get things in line, and then keep moving, returning the oversight back to the department once things are righted. So some basic building blocks in terms of who the players are in SGMA. Now, what is sustainability under SGMA? This is a unique approach to defining sustainability. So sustainability under SGMA is defined as operating to a sustainable yield. So we can think about a water budget for a given basin. There's the inputs, the outputs. Obviously, if you're taking more out than is coming in, you're depleting that basin. That's one step. But layered on top of this is the avoidance of undesirable results. And this is where the local control comes in. We really want local agencies to engage with the beneficial uses and users of these waters within their basins to define what is a significant and unreasonable impact to the basin that they want to avoid. So not only operating to a yield, but also avoiding these impacts. And those impacts include chronic lowering of groundwater levels, significant reductions of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and probably the most technically challenging one, the depletion of interconnected surface waters and streams. So what's in a groundwater sustainability plan? So we've developed regulations to help local agencies understand what is required to be defined in these and provide information so that we can see that they have a clear plan towards meeting their objectives, which is operating to sustainable yield and avoiding those undesirable results. So basic sections, who is this? Who's in the basin? Who are our beneficial uses and users? Who are the local agencies that are part of this? Who are the counties and cities and all the people that are reliant upon the groundwater resources in the state? The what? What's going on in the basin in terms of groundwater? What are the conditions? What's the geology? What's the land use practices? What is your water budget for this basin? What are the inputs and outputs? And as you can imagine, in California, we have a lot of water coming into and out of basins through surface water projects and moving waters through canals and those kinds of things, taking water from where it is up north for us to the south where we have most of our beneficial users. So it's a very complex system in that sense that we have to not only account for what's going on physically and under natural conditions within the basin, but then also what is managed and imported and out and exported from the basins. Then we have the where aspect. How are the local agencies quantifying and demonstrating to all the beneficial uses and users and the department how they are avoiding these undesirable results? So this required the establishment of several metrics, quantifiable metrics. The first of which is the minimum threshold. So below which you might start to see adverse conditions occur and potentially undesirable results. And then measurable objective. What's your target? Where are you going to create a target for you to achieve? So rather than manage to scarcity, we're going to push it towards managing towards abundance. We want to have this buffer, if you will, of water well above the threshold below which you could be having bad things happen. And then how? This is the big ticket item. Many of these basins are in overdraft, and they are looking at how can they implement projects and management actions to balance that water budget and avoid the undesirable results. So effectively, there's two knobs. There's a supply knob and there's a demand knob. Most agencies don't even want to look at the demand knob. They want to add more supply so they can maintain their current, economies and social structures. We're largely talking about agriculture in these basins where SGMA is being applied. Demand reduction means the reduction of agricultural footprint, largely. in and amongst conservation efforts and those kinds of things. So it's really challenging for local agencies to say, this is a great idea. We need to reduce the demand, which means stopping pumping. Early projections for the impact to the agricultural community were anywhere from 750,000 to 1 million acres of agricultural lands may need to be brought out of production. That takes a significant hit in terms of the food and fiber produced for the nation, not just California. So these are impacting issues that affect more than just California. And so just want to flag that for you. These are challenging issues that we're trying to work through and find additional solutions to increase supply to the greatest extent possible. So again, I highlighted we had a rulemaking process. We developed both a set of regulations for basin boundary modifications. So we want to rely upon the best available science. And this is a great opportunity for local agencies to come forward and say, yeah, DWR, you don't have the best information. Here's some detailed analysis that we've done. This is how our basin is configured that we can manage it. So those are out there. We've already had a couple of rounds of those. We're now on hold in that process, just allowing for the groundwater sustainability plans to take effect and start to learn more information. And then we also have the regulations for the groundwater sustainability plans. So I alluded to the groundwater sustainability agencies. We have more than 250 new government agencies now tasked with managing groundwater in a state that hasn't been managed before under a regulatory structure. So this is a big task and a big move. And I'll just say that all of the local agencies stepped forward and took this challenge on. So we had 99.9% compliance for this thing, and the 0.1% was administrative challenges that they were working through, and we resolved those. So we see strong commitment towards implementing this. People recognize the necessity of it, despite it being so challenging to implement. And then where do we see this happening? So we look across the basins. So SGMA required a couple of sets of submissions. In 2020, we've identified the critically overdrafted basins. Those basins had to submit their groundwater sustainability plans to us by January of 2020. All the remaining high and medium priority basins were required to submit plans in 2022. So you can see there's a little bit of a staggered effect, with the law calling upon the most impacted basins to take action early rather than later. One of the complexities of SGMA is it allows for, despite the basin being the base unit of compliance, the area over which we're trying to define sustainability, it also allowed for multiple plans to be submitted for these basins. And as you can imagine, at the local level, there's a lot of dispute about how things get done. And this creates a lot of challenges for accurately and consistently quantifying our resources and how it's to be managed. So what you can see in the graphic on the right is we have a majority of our critically overdrafted basins submitting a single plan that covers the basin, but a handful that are submitting multiple plans. Those plans have to be managed under a coordination agreement, which clearly defines the methodologies for the quantification of the metrics in the basin. That's a tall order. Most people like to do it their way and not the other guy's way. So it presents a significant challenge, but most are working through those challenges and taking significant actions. Again, I'll just touch on the basins that we've been working in. The graphic on the left, we've identified 515 discrete alluvial basins within the state. And these are the base unit for compliance under SGMA. We also had to conduct a prioritization process where we identified categories of very low through high for this purpose. And you can see the middle graphic highlights those in orange and yellow as those that are medium or high priority and are required to comply with SGMA, develop GSAs and GSPs. So what does prioritization mean? It's not a reflection of bad water quality conditions. It's a reflection of the dependence on groundwater within that basin. How important is groundwater to their water supply portfolio? Should it be managed or not? So that's how the prioritization really shuffles out. And there's a pretty significant effort to compile all of this data and information. On top of that, we identified critically overdrafted basins. And these are basins where we have known impacts: chronic groundwater level declines, dewatering of water supply wells, subsidence conditions, seawater intrusion, or significant degradation of the water quality within the basin. So those have been flagged for quite some time and are now, got a purposeful meaning once Sigma was created as to how to move forward. Okay, so where do we stand? We have currently received all of the groundwater sustainability plans from all of those high and medium priority basins, including the critically overdrafted basins. Again, another major milestone for the program. People are taking this seriously and taking significant actions to address this so that they have water resiliency moving forward. So where we stand right now is from those basins, from those plans submitted in 2020, we had 8 of the 21 plans that were submitted be approved. When we approve a plan, it's not just a stamp, congratulations, move forward. More often than not, there are small deficiencies that we're asking them to correct over their implementation period. These could be filling of data gaps, addressing small discrepancies within their plan. So there is no perfect plan. They're going to continue to work on this and evolve this throughout the 20-year implementation period. However, of these 21 plans, we also identified 13 that had significant deficiencies that needed to be addressed. Sigma allows for us to provide 180 days. It's not a lot of time, 6 months, for these agencies to understand what the deficiency is, address the deficiency, and resubmit it back to the department. So that's where we're at right now. These agencies all resubmitted their plans back in July of 2022. And we are about ready to start releasing the assessments for those resubmissions. So within this first quarter, we're going to start rolling out the assessments that really tell them what track they're on. Are they going to be talking with the state board, or are they going to continue to implement their plan and address recommendations from the department? You notice there's one basin out here that was identified as inadequate. And that was really an administrative issue. And they've been working with our sister agency, the backstop, at the State Water Resource Control Board, to rectify that and keep moving forward. Remember, the intent of Sigma is for local control. So despite a determination of inadequacy, it is the intent of the state agencies to correct the deficiencies and get them right back into local control and local implementation of their plans. So some of the common themes, I included this slide just to help you understand, the big ticket item is eliminating overdraft, but that's not the only thing, right? We still have to consider how the groundwater conditions. You may have eliminated overdraft, but you may be operating now at a lower groundwater level that may have an effect on subsidence, may have an effect on seawater intrusion, or the depletions of interconnected surface waters. So it's a very tall order to think about one of these actions, but then how do these actions relate to one another, and how does this play out? So we need the local agencies to have some time to work on these things, and that's why we're working with them to provide this. The graphic on the right really kind of illustrates some of those quantifiable metrics that we described, and this comes from some of our guidance documents that we've put out to support local agencies in getting through this. So you can see there's a minimum threshold line, below which bad things can happen. But one of the things I want to highlight with this graphic, you can see there's a dot there, IM1. We also define that they can say we have interim milestones. So a basin may be on a trajectory heading towards those undesirable results, but we recognize that they may be implementing projects to rectify that thing. So we acknowledge that they might dip below that minimum threshold line, but then as the project gets implemented, as they add additional supply, we'll see it come out of that and start leading towards its measurable objective. That's just one of the many pathways that local agencies are looking to get through this. But the bottom line is, it's all based upon what the impacts are to the beneficial uses and users in the basin. So what are some of the common themes that we're seeing in our assessments and where the challenges lie with the groundwater sustainability plans. So I mentioned the multi-GSP, multi-groundwater sustainability plan basins. The lack of coordination is probably the most significant. Even in the basins where there's single plans, it's about being coordinated. It's about bringing people together and talking through the appropriate methodologies to quantifying what the water resources are and how best to implement those. Other significant challenges that we've provided comment on are the depletion of interconnected surface waters, groundwater level impacts, so chronic groundwater level declines and how they affect those beneficial uses and users. As you can imagine, domestic wells are commonly the most shallow wells. So when you drop groundwater levels pretty far, you can start to dewater those wells. And we're seeing a significant impact throughout this drought that we're experiencing right now in that arena. Water quality, including discussions of water quality, is important and required as part of this act, despite there being an entire another set of regulations that manage water quality, both of surface water and groundwater within the state that lives under the State Water Resource Control Board. It's really acknowledgement that that program exists and understanding as to how they are going to, complement those efforts and make sure that those groundwater quality conditions aren't exacerbated through the implementation of their plans. And probably the most significant one is subsidence. And if you're unaware of subsidence, subsidence is one of those conditions that, due to groundwater pumping, we are depressurizing confining layers, the clays in these aquifers, and allowing for the collapse of those clays. When that collapse occurs, we start to see a deflection of the land surface downward as those sediments compact. That both represents a loss of storage, but also has a significant impact on the surface infrastructure that we rely upon. Of note, the Central Valley project, which is our federal water project, it runs along the east side of our San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley. They experienced some subsidence conditions in the region that have resulted in a loss of capacity, conveyance capacity of that canal of up to 60%. That's cutting off a huge amount of water for a lot of people in the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley and is really creating problems. The federal government, state government, and local governments have all chipped in to repair these things, but we need to address the root cause, which is the subsidence, the overpumping of those aquifers, and that's where Sigma comes in. So we're doing those simultaneously, and I'll just say it's not without a lot of significant challenges ahead. So quickly on implementation, we've done all of these things I've described. We've got the law, we established GSAs, we've received the first plans from all of the different categories, and we're out here in implementation. So once the local agencies have locally adopted these plans, they are in implementation mode. Our job is just to say whether or not it's compliant with the act. They still have a plan that is very pertinent to their basin. It may not quite pencil out, but it's something that they're going to work on over the next 20 years. They're all required to reach their sustainability goals by 2040 or 2042, depending upon what their starting point was. Every 5 years, they're required to update their plans and submit them to the department to demonstrate progress towards meeting their objectives and make adjustments as they fill data gaps and learn more about their basin. Annually, they are also required to report quantitative values for the cumulative groundwater extraction and ideally reporting on implementation progress. How are they implementing their projects and management actions to support their plan? So that's the regulatory aspects of what DWR is doing. I find this to be the best part. What kind of assistance are we providing? One of the things that I've really appreciated about joining the Department of Water Resources is really the vast volumes of data that they had already, the willingness to collect more data, and most importantly, making all of that data readily accessible. So I'll share some websites with you where you can see some of the volumes of data that we've pulled together to make Sigma function, allow local agencies to be well informed as they're making critical decisions. But in general, our assistance program falls into 3 buckets. financial assistance. We've rolled out over $400 million to these local agencies to develop plans and develop projects and management actions and get them started. Technical assistance. We've been physically out there installing new monitoring wells for them. We've been revising existing data sets like our well log data sets, making them not only more accessible, but digitizing them so that they can be easily adapted and input into numerical models or other uses, electronic uses. We've been collecting land subsidence data. This is INSAR data, a remote sensed data set that evaluates the land surface. And we've been advancing aerial electromagnetic geophysics to help characterize these basins further, to tell people where are we seeing the greatest preponderance of coarse-grained sediments versus fine-grained sediments, so that they can make informed decisions as they're implementing projects to enhance supply, like recharge projects. We've also provided a number of platforms to access these data. So one of our flagships is the Cal Groundwater Live webpage. You can get on there and see kind of the current state of conditions within our groundwater systems. All of our data is funneled back through there that's coming from these GSPs. So we're still building some of these things. They're going to be continuing works in progress. We'll add new bells and whistles as we go. But if you're so curious, I'll share these links and you can browse around. We also have the Sigma Data Viewer, which is a parallel product. Cal Groundwater Live is a little more focused on public entities, folks wanting to understand what's going on in their basin. And the Sigma Data Viewer is really focused a little bit more on the technical practitioner, somebody who's really looking to access the data. It's a great map, but all of these data sets are made available through our California Natural Resources Agency's open data platform. And this is a big push that Sigma has been leading the charge in a number of fronts and providing all of our data out there in a very transparent manner. And that's one of our big driving mantras here, is that we want Sigma to be transparent. There isn't going to be any hidden messages or backroom discussions. This is all happening out in real time. And it's a little uneasy for most folks involved with this, but it's having an effect, and people appreciate the openness and conversations and now have a greater understanding as to how the decisions are being made in some of these basins. So where are we now? The next steps through our implementation. We're really supporting local agencies in addressing their data gaps and addressing their corrective actions. We're providing a lot of data and support through our regional offices. We're providing that funding, getting projects off the ground, getting new recharge efforts going on. We're also building that local capacity. We're trying to provide support to these groundwater sustainability agencies because they're now faced with implementing what are quite expensive projects to achieve. So they're having to go out and we have a function here, a law within the state that requires any new fee or tax that needs to go to a public vote. And it's very challenging to explain to somebody, we need X number of $1 million to implement this recharge project, and you should vote for this. So we have a large educational campaign going. We're trying to help locals understand where their water's coming from, why it's important for the GSAs to receive the funding they need to implement the plan. So it's a real challenge from an educational standpoint as well. So, we're not only thinking within our box of Sigma, but we're broadening this out and making sure that people understand, what possible support structures are out there. So one in particular we've put out there just actually 2 days ago, we've released the Land Flex program. This is really a fallowing type of program that is targeted at addressing where agricultural lands sit adjacent to disadvantaged communities who are experiencing depletions of their drinking water supplies. So we're talking about taking those agricultural lands out of practice, stopping the pumping from those wells that may be affecting the drinking water supply for those disadvantaged communities, and paying for those local growers to transition to what is a sustainable groundwater management allocation that has been provided to them for the acreage that they have. There's a lot of cuts coming for a lot of these basins. They've been significantly overdrafted for a long time. So a big program that we're rolling out currently. we're also advancing concepts about groundwater trading. How can we trade our allocations within these basins? And we're helping local agencies prop up accounting platforms so that they can accurately and transparently conduct these trades of these groundwaters. And that includes the use of OpenET. And I don't know if you've heard about OpenET, but it is an open source software package being developed by Environmental Defense Fund and others that really is a remote sense based water use estimate to model. But it helps kind of level the playing field about I grow this type of crop, it uses X amount of water. That type of crop should use similar amounts of water, but climatic changes or climatic conditions affect that volume. So this estimating tool is useful at least at leveling the playing field for people to have conversations about how water gets traded and accounted for within these basins. And supply augmentation functions. We've had a number of recent water supply strategy paper that was released that really directed our department at finding ways to expedite the permitting process for conducting recharge. So I've been involved with that quite closely, and we are working hard to make sure that we're capturing those high flows when they're present and spreading them out on our land surface, allowing them to infiltrate and recharge our groundwater basins. But we're coming out of a legacy period where groundwater hasn't been managed in this way. And so we have a lot of rules and regulations intended to prevent the abuse of some of these water resources. And so we're finding new pathways and expediting those so that the local agencies and growers can divert waters and get them onto the ground when those waters are available. I'm sure you've seen the latest news. California's been in a 3-year drought, and we get hit with 3 weeks of storms that drop tremendous amounts of water on us, almost like Washington. But it's coming fast and furious and maybe too much to manage. And so we're trying to find ways to peel those off and store them more effectively. And then we're also leveraging executive orders from our governor to allow us to move and act on some of these recharge projects that we're in our mind, low-hanging fruit. Let's get water out on our agricultural lands or open and working lands where there isn't concern for water quality impacts and get those functioning as recharge properties to the greatest extent possible. So beyond what the department is doing, we also are reaching out to our sister agencies across the board throughout the state, recognizing that some transition of agricultural lands will be necessary. So we've engaged with our Department of Conservation, our Department of Food and Agriculture, as well as our governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, recognizing that some transition of our workforce may be necessary to accommodate changes in our land use practices. So a lot of moving parts here, and we are at the starting gate still on Sigma. So things are going to take a little bit of time to take effect, but they are acting now, and I think we're heading in the right direction. So I'm going to stop there and love to engage in questions and answers and have a conversation about what's going on with Sigma.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that wonderful presentation. I guess either feel free to put comments or questions in the chat, or raise your hand and you can ask, or using the reactions function, raise your hand, and then we can get those questions going.
Do you think that 5-year updates are frequent enough, or would you like to see them happen more frequently, especially in this earlier phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. 5-year interval that was defined in the legislation, and it seems to be a pretty reasonable time frame for people to redress their plans. Some of these plans are in excess of a couple thousand pages. So these aren't small, brief levels of effort that local agencies are having to go through. The department has up to 2 years to review these things, and we're finding that that's pretty short as well. I mean, these are complex plans. These are large areas in many instances. So the 5-year interval is probably appropriate, but where we really need to go is how we embrace on an annual basis small changes, engage with local agencies, help them address the changes that they're seeing. Climate change is a significant part of this planning process, which is also unique to many regulatory programs. We're asking them to project out 50 years and to describe how they foresee the climate change affecting their plan. That's a pretty tall order for many of these agencies. So that's going to evolve, and I think the 5-year time frame can start to capture some of those changes.
Thank you.
So I think one of the stark contrasts that I've learned in working with state of Oregon, state of Washington, looking at how they differ is just how the water rights are administered. Groundwater is really overseen by the state and administered as a water right, if I'm understanding it correctly, where the department, we're not administering water rights. In fact, Sigma calls out directly, this does not affect your groundwater right. So that's a very difficult thing for most to wrap their head around. Effectively, they have the ability, because they own the property overlying the groundwater, if they pump it and put it to beneficial use, that's compliant with state laws, water rights. However, we now have agencies saying, while you have that right, we also have an obligation to avoid these undesirable results. So here's an allocation about how much you can pump. And that's a really challenging thing. It's a significant change in the way we've operated historically. So these are big changes in the water world in California. Well, I hope this was helpful, at least in understanding what pathway we're on. It was a lot of information. I'm sorry to fire hose this stuff at you, but I'm happy to entertain any questions. Feel free, drop them in email. I'll make these slides available. I'll also provide some of the links to some of our data sets. Happy to discuss, our approaches for collection and administration of those data. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts here.
I guess if there aren't any more questions, we can end it early so everybody can have 15 minutes back with their lunch. But yes, again, this is recorded, so it will be available on the YouTube. And thank you so much for coming. Sorry about the issues with signing in. And thank you so much, Tim, for joining.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.